America's open door. The mass migrations that had given the country its special character were over. The new law was designed to halt immigration from Europe's poorest regions. The new Americans who had come from those lands, Italians, Jews, and others, felt that they themselves were being attacked. For the Jews in America, it was a time of confusion. They had every reason to believe that they or their children might find success and acceptance in America, but they also had reason to fear. There were many Americans who resented the success of anyone who was not white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant, and in the 1920s it seemed that intolerance might gain the upper hand. Intolerance had been growing since the last quarter of the 19th century. Successful German Jews had been excluded from hotels, resorts, clubs, and private schools, but they were not content to remain silent in the face of discrimination. By the beginning of the 20th century, they established organizations dedicated not only to the protection of their rights, but to the defense of Jewish communities in other lands as well. Organizations such as the American Jewish Committee and the Anti-Defamation League of B'nai B'rith. At the end of the First World War, concern for the welfare of Jewish refugees in Europe led growing numbers to support the call for the establishment of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. The American Jewish Congress, Hadassah, the Zionist Organization of America, and other Jewish institutions began to play an important role in international Jewish affairs as anti-Semitism threatened in many lands, even in America. In the 1920s, German and East European Jews alike faced a resurgence of American-style intolerance. It was expressed through discrimination in housing and employment, through admissions quotas at universities, and through exclusion from the elite social institutions of America. But elite society was only a small part of the American world. "25 million immigrants had come to the cities of America since 1880. They had changed the flavor of its culture, the accent of its speech, its dress, its humor, and its sense of self. America's popular culture was new and vital. It drew on the energies, the experiences, the dreams of many peoples. Out of the Jewish neighborhoods of New York, Chicago, and dozens of other American cities came a bursting forth of talent and achievement in every phase of American life.
Blue sky, smiling at me, nothing but blue sky do I see. Oh, to, bluebird, singing a song, nothing but little bluebird all day long.
These immigrants and children of immigrants eagerly discovered new opportunities in technologies and art forms that had never existed before, where prejudice was no barrier. Most of America's film pioneers were Jews: Louis B. Mayer, Samuel Goldwyn, Adolf Zukor. Many of the stars were Jews: Emanuel Goldenberg, known as Edward G. Robinson, Melvin Hesselberg, Melvin Douglas, Theodosia Goodman, Theda Bara, the Marx Brothers. The Jews had come to America with dreams of a new life. They went on to reflect and to shape in the films they made the dreams of all America. But the majority of the Jews took other paths into the mainstream of American life. If their fathers had been students of the Talmud, given to poring over the intricacies of religious law, the children took their love of study and discussion and gave it new form. Through the colleges and universities of America, they made their way into new careers in law, in medicine, in the sciences, in government, and in teaching. The impoverished Jews who had come from Eastern Europe had passed through the crowded slums of America's cities and within 2 generations had reached a place of distinction in American life. Among the many Jews who figured prominently in these years were Louis Brandeis and Felix Frankfurter, justices of the United States Supreme Court, Bernard Baruch, statesman and advisor to presidents, the writers Gertrude Stein, George S. Kaufman, and Clifford Odets, the composers Aaron Copland, Irving Berlin, and George Gershwin, and there were others beyond count. What made all this possible was the very character of American civilization, above all its diversity. It was not a uniform culture, as in England, France, Poland, Germany. If you were different in America, so were many other people. The Jews were just one group among many who joined in this new world. And in the rich and diverse society of America, Jews found a kind of acceptance they had never experienced anywhere else. The Jews became an integral and creative part of American civilization. With all others who had come to these shores, the Jews had helped to shape and had themselves been shaped by the America they called the Golden Land. These Jews who had joined and prospered in America were soon to witness in the 1930s and 1940s the terrors of a gathering storm that would burst upon their brethren in Europe.
Who could these men be? What authority did they represent? Kay lived in a country with a legal constitution. There was universal peace. All the laws were in force. Who dared to seize him in his own dwelling? Where was the judge he had never seen? Where was the high court? He raised his hands, but the hands of one of the partners were already at Kay's throat, while the other thrust the knife into his heart and turned it there twice.
Joseph Kay, the hero of Franz Kafka's novel, The Trial, goes to his death without ever knowing what his offense might have been. His enemy is the unbridled, irrational, emotionless power of a modern totalitarian state. We have in this century too often seen this legalized nightmare occur in reality, a nightmare that we now call Kafkaesque, with its street policemen, street thugs, and concentration camps, where death can become an industry of the state. It is fitting that Kafka, the prophet of this horror, should have been born a Jew, for the Jews of Europe were to experience the first half of the 20th century as a Kafkaesque ordeal, a time which promised them freedom and equality, but which brought them to the brink of annihilation. At first, in the 1920s, the mood was optimistic. 19th century stuffiness was dispelled. There was a new sense of liberty, and even of excess. Profound changes in how we thought of ourselves, of the world, even of the universe, were working down into popular consciousness. In 1921, Albert Einstein was awarded the Nobel laureate. He came to symbolize not only the new intellectual order, but also the final and complete emancipation of West European Jewry. Like Freud, he became one of the Jewish patriarchs of the modern world. The numbers of Jews in scientific, artistic, and public life increased as formal barriers against them fell away. The sting of modernism in art and its roaring sophistication symbolized general license and decadence to those who needed stability and certainty in their lives. They found the modern world confused, tense, frenzied. Appeals to order and traditional morality were in vogue. In Italy, the journalist Mussolini seized power. Hundreds of political opponents were murdered. Believing in the disciplines of a vanished past, he adopted the sticks and axes of ancient Roman authority as the symbol of his regime, the fasces, fascists, fascism. It was an age without consensus, an age of extremes. Individualism versus conformity, liberty versus subservience to the state. And for the Jews, inevitably caught up in this conflict, the consequences were to be tragic. The vast majority of Jews lived in Eastern Europe, far from the world of the few privileged Jewish artists, scientists, and businessmen of the West. Visitors taking home movies in the 20s would notice few signs of modern times in the shtetl, the market town. But the appearance of tradition was to a certain extent deceptive. By the early 30s, there were 9.5 million Jews in Europe, mostly Yiddish-speaking. They were increasingly secular and increasingly urban, living in the cities of Poland, Lithuania, Romania, and Hungary, communities poor in worldly goods, but rich in vitality and diversity. Some supported traditional religious life, others denied it. Some stressed Jewish difference, others sought assimilation. Whatever road they took, the Jews paid for the freedom, creativity, and prominence which some, a very few of them, achieved. This limited success fueled traditional hatred of the Jews as aliens and competitors. Nevertheless, Jewish cultural life of all kinds flourished. Yiddish produced a popular literature, a tradition of stage plays, and now a small movie industry. In Hebrew and Polish, as well as in Yiddish, the Jewish press thrived. There was a vigorous debate about what being Jewish meant, from the traditionalists to the socialists to the Zionists. Zionism was taken up by a minority who felt increasingly the constraints of anti-Semitism all around them.
I did not see any prospects for a future after I finished school. In this terrible situation, I took to Zionism like a drowning person to a board.
The one aim is to go to Palestine.
These Polish youngsters were smitten by a dream. Jewish resettlement of Palestine had begun. It was progressing slowly, but it was underway. Another road into the modern world, a road away from the centuries-old traditions of European Jewry. Traditional Jewish life faced challenges everywhere. In Russia, after the revolution, Jews who had little enough reason to support the old order were found among the communist leaders. The revolution reached into every corner of life, and although it broke the walls of Tsarist oppression, it also directly threatened Jewish traditions. But the central threat to traditional Jewish life in Europe developed in the West, in the state with the most modern, most assimilated Jewish community, Germany. In the 1840s, the Jewish poet Heine had called this land
a modern Palestine, the home of philosophy, the mother soil of prophecy, and the citadel of pure spirituality.
Defeated in the World War, Germany was now embodied in a faltering democracy, the Weimar Republic. Inflation and then depression destroyed the value of her people's savings and wages. The bread lines lengthened as jobs vanished. Weimar's politics constantly slipped into extremism. On the far right, the National Socialists, the Nazis, made a bid to turn all of Germany's discontents to their advantage. Although the Nazi platform might have been deranged, it was as coherent in its way as any other political program of the day. It promised bread and work and was seen by many as a clear alternative to the chaos of Weimar. Nuremberg, a symbol of the glories of Germany's past. The Nazis were to turn this vision into a dark romance of blood, soil, race, and honor. By appropriating and distorting all of German history, they mounted a successful appeal across the deep divisions of Weimar society. The Nazi Party began as a revolutionary gang, terrorizing all opponents. But by the late 20s, Hitler himself was leaving these tactics behind to seek office
through the ballot. The party became so popular that 1 out of every 3 Germans, without compulsion, was regularly voting Nazi. After the election of January 1933, Hitler became Weimar's last chancellor. His contempt for the democracy he had manipulated was total. He rapidly silenced all opposition. Within 6 months of the election, gestures of protest such as this became impossible. Democracy was banned. Hitler was dictator. Mussolini said,
"Fascism is a religion. The 20th century will be known in history as the century of fascism."
Hitler was proclaimed the father of the nation, the son of the race, the spirit of the folk. A fantasy of total conformity and subjugation fed the Nazis' dark dream. All the liberal ideals of the modern world were to be cauterized, burned out, put to the flame. Sigmund Freud, who had in 1924 received the Goethe Prize, not for his science, but for the purity and elegance of his German prose, wrote, "What progress we are making. In the Middle Ages, they would have burned me. Nowadays, they are content with burning my books." But Freud was wrong. The Nazis were not to be content with the burning of books.
Das Zeitalter eines überspitzten jüdischen Intellektualismus ist nun zu Ende.
The ideas in the books were to be destroyed, and all who persisted in believing in those ideas were to be destroyed as well.
Sondern auch ein Mensch des Charakters sein. Dazu wollen wir euch verpflichten.
Dachau. A quiet community a few miles from Munich, noted only for the ferocity of its local brown shirts. It was here that the Nazis set up their first concentration camp to test the limits of their new power. They rounded up communists and churchmen, liberals and social democrats, all who opposed them. German society and the German courts turned a blind eye. The Nazis, a small band of determined extremists, had successfully overturned the central balance of government.
At first, most Jews, bystanders in Weimar's extremist politics, were not subjected to the concentration camp unless they were politically active against the regime. But this was not long to remain the case. On the street, the Nazis presented the Jew as the enemy who moved all other enemies. They used the radicalism of a few Jews and the wealth of a few more as sticks with which to beat the whole community. Nazi hatred had no rational basis. It was, in essence, an amalgam of racial hysteria and prejudice, a dangerous paranoia.
The early phase of Nazi rule was one of humiliation and public vilification, intermittent street violence, boycotts, and of signs saying, "Jews not wanted."
I had walked the streets in Berlin and saw milling crowds in front of various stores with Jewish names. I felt completely at a loss. I didn't know what it's all about until I came to the tobacconists, and I saw a very large crowd standing in front, yelling on top of their voices.